The seating chart for the Starlight Charity Ball was a grid of quiet power and silent resentments. Eleanor Vance moved names across the digital screen with the tip of her finger, a general rearranging her troops before a battle of pleasantries. The caterer's final menu was approved, the orchestra's program was set, and the security detail was confirmed. Her work, for the most part, was done. From her small, book-lined study, the only room in the penthouse that felt truly hers, she could hear the distant, muted siren song of Park Avenue 10 floors below. The scent of old paper and leather-bound books, her inheritance, mingled with the faint, clean notes of freesia from the vase on her desk. This ball was the last, most glittering piece of her family's legacy still in her hands. Her grandmother had founded it 70 years ago, a beacon of hope after the war. Now it was Eleanor's duty to ensure its light did not dim. She ended the final planning call with a polite but firm confirmation and leaned back in her chair. The silence of the apartment descended again, a heavy, expensive quiet that always felt more like absence than peace. Her eyes drifted to a silver-framed photograph on the corner of her desk. It was the only personal object she kept there, a sepia-toned image of her great-grandmother, Amelia Vance, taken in 1928. Amelia stood tall and poised, her gaze direct, her expression one of gentle confidence. She was a woman who knew her place in the world and was comfortable in it. But it was not Amelia's face that held Eleanor's attention. It was what lay against the dark velvet of her dress. The Vance Starlight. Even in the faded photograph, the necklace was alive. A magnificent cornflower blue sapphire, impossibly deep and clear, sat at the center. Around it, a starburst of antique-cut diamonds cascaded outward, designed to catch the light from every angle and shatter it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It was more than jewelry, it was a piece of their family's soul, forged in a time of prosperity and worn as a symbol of their enduring name. Eleanor's mother used to tell her stories about it. She said that when Amelia wore it, the necklace seemed to hum with a life of its own, pulsing with a soft blue light like a captured star. Eleanor reached out, her fingers tracing the cool glass over the image. The story always ended the same way. The great crash, the dwindling fortunes, the desperate measures. The Vance Starlight was sold in the early 50s to a faceless European industrialist to keep the family estate from being dismantled. It was a necessary sacrifice, a wound that had never properly healed. The sale was a quiet shame that had been passed down through the women in her family, a ghost of lost splendor. They had lost other things, properties and stocks and influence, but the necklace was different. It was the thing they talked about in hushed, wistful tones. Finding it, bringing it back, was a fantasy Eleanor had harbored since she was a little girl, a fairy tale she told herself on lonely nights. She imagined the weight of it on her own skin, a connection to the formidable women who came before her. A soft chime echoed through the penthouse, the sound of the private elevator arriving directly in their foyer. The spell was broken. Eleanor stood and walked from the warm, cluttered comfort of her study into the vast, minimalist living room. The change was always jarring. Out here, everything was black, white, and gray. Polished marble floors, stark white walls adorned with abstract art Richard had bought at auction, and floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed Central Park like a beautiful, untouchable painting. The space was immaculate, cold, and impersonal. It felt less like a home and more like the lobby of a very exclusive hotel. Richard Sterling stepped out of the elevator. He was handsome, sharp, and exuded an aura of restless energy. His dark suit was impeccably tailored. His shoes gleamed under the recessed lighting, and his hair was perfect. He looked as though he had been sculpted from ambition itself. He did not look at her. His attention was already captured by the small, glowing screen of his phone. "Richard," Eleanor said, her voice even. He grunted in response, his thumb swiping across the glass. "Evening." He walked past her, shrugging out of his jacket and tossing it onto a severe-looking chrome chair where it sat, a lone disruption in the room's perfect order. The faint, expensive scent of his cologne, a citrus and wood smoke blend, filled the air, overpowering the subtle freesia from her study. "How was your day?" she asked, following him as he moved toward the bar. "Long deals, the usual," he said, his words clipped. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, the amber liquid splashing against the heavy crystal of the glass. He still had not made eye contact with her. His gaze remained fixed on his phone, which he held in his other hand. A faint smile touched his lips, a private, intimate expression she had not seen directed at her in years. A familiar, cold knot formed in Eleanor's stomach. It was a feeling she had grown accustomed to, a dull ache of being invisible in her own home. She decided to try another topic, one that had to involve her. The final plans for the ball are in place. Everything is ready for Saturday. He took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes finally lifting from the screen to scan the room, as if noticing it for the first time. "Good," he said, his voice flat. "Make sure my table is clear. I don't want to be seated next to that bore from the museum board again. And no reporters." "It's our table, Richard," she corrected gently. "And I have taken care of the seating. I was thinking of inviting the columnist from the Chronicle. She's an old family friend." He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "Your family's friends are relics, Eleanor. This is about the future, about Sterling Corp. I need people who are useful." He finished his drink in one swallow and set the glass down on the marble countertop with a sharp click. "It's just another night of shaking hands and pretending to care about charity. A necessary evil." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, and each one found its mark. He dismissed her world, her legacy, with the same casual arrogance he used to dismiss a junior analyst in a board meeting. She felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to argue, to defend the importance of the tradition, to tell him that this ball built hospitals and funded scholarships, that it meant something more than a networking opportunity. But she knew it was pointless. He saw her heritage as a brand he had acquired, a charming accessory that gave his new money the polish of old prestige. He had married the Vance name, and she had simply come with it. Her hands found the back of a sleek leather sofa, her fingers gripping the cool material to steady herself. She maintained her posture, the graceful composure that had been drilled into her since birth. On the outside, she was Eleanor Vance Sterling, the poised and perfect hostess. Inside, a silent scream was building, a desperate cry against the cold, empty space that had grown between them. He was already turning away, his attention drawn back to his phone, to the secret world that made him smile. He took a few steps toward his own study, a room that was a mirror of his corporate office downtown, all steel and glass. Then he stopped. He did not turn around completely, just paused and spoke over his shoulder as if delivering an afterthought. "By the way," he said, his tone suddenly lighter, laced with a smug sort of amusement, "don't worry about trying to stand out on Saturday. I've already taken care of it." Eleanor stood frozen, her grip tightening on the sofa. What did that mean? He half turned then, a sliver of a triumphant smile on his face. "I've arranged for a little surprise, something truly show-stopping. It will be the only thing anyone talks about." A tiny, foolish flutter of hope stirred in Eleanor's chest. A surprise for her? The thought was so foreign, so unexpected, that it felt like a mirage. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to wonder. Maybe he did remember their anniversary last month, which had passed without a word. Perhaps he had noticed the way she lingered over jewelry catalogs, dreaming of things long lost. Maybe, just maybe, this was a peace offering, a grand gesture meant to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. He wanted to make her shine. He wanted people to talk. Richard didn't wait for her response. He simply continued on his way, disappearing into his study and closing the heavy door behind him, leaving her alone in the vast, silent living room. She was left standing there, bathed in the cool light of the city skyline, clinging to a dangerous new question. The cold knot in her stomach was still there, but now it was tangled with a fragile, tentative thread of hope, and Eleanor could not decide which feeling was worse. The word hung in the air of the vast, silent penthouse, a fragile ghost from the night before. Surprise. Eleanor had replayed it in her mind as she lay in the cool sheets of their bed, long after Richard's breathing had evened out into the deep, untroubled sleep of a man without a conscience. She had stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint lines the city lights projected there, and allowed a tiny, dangerous seed of hope to be planted in the barren soil of her heart. A show-stopping surprise. For her. It had to be for her. After so many years of quiet distance, of polite conversations that felt like business meetings? Was he finally trying to bridge the chasm that had opened between them? The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp-edged shadows across the polished white marble. The view over Central Park was breathtaking, a sea of green and gold under a pale blue sky. But Eleanor felt none of its beauty. The apartment was always too clean, too sterile, like a museum exhibit of a wealthy life rather than a home. The air smelled of nothing but expensive cleaning fluids and the faint, cold scent of glass. She sat at one end of the long dining table, a porcelain cup of black coffee warming her hands. She had chosen her seat carefully, wanting to face him, to search his face for any lingering warmth from last night's promise. Richard was already there, at the opposite end of the table, a king in his own minimalist kingdom. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, the fabric impeccable, his tie a slash of silver silk. He looked less like her husband and more like the CEO he was, ready to dissect the day and conquer it. Beside his plate of untouched toast lay his phone, face up, a sleek, dark rectangle that seemed to command all of his attention. Eleanor cleared her throat, the small sound loud in the unnerving quiet. "Did you sleep well, Richard?" she asked. Her voice was steady, practiced in its pleasantness. He glanced up, his eyes briefly meeting hers before flicking back to the screen. "Fine, Eleanor. Busy day ahead. We're closing the preliminary financing on the merger." He tapped the screen with his thumb, his movements quick and precise. There was no follow-up question. "No, and you?" There never was anymore. Eleanor took a slow sip of her coffee. It was bitter on her tongue. "About the ball," she began, trying again. "I've confirmed the seating arrangements with the committee. Our table is perfectly positioned, right by the stage." She was hoping he would pick up the thread, perhaps drop another hint about his surprise. She wanted to believe it was something wonderful, something that would make the whole ballroom gasp and remind everyone that she was not just a Vance, but Mrs. Richard Sterling, the cherished wife. "Good," he said, his focus still locked on the device in his hand. "Make sure Thomas is seated far from my investors." His sour face could curdle the champagne. A small sting of irritation pricked at Eleanor. Her brother Thomas had never hidden his disdain for Richard, seeing him as a corporate pirate who had plundered the Vance name for legitimacy. "Thomas is my brother. He will sit at our table, as he always does." Richard didn't answer. A message must have arrived because his thumb stopped its impatient scrolling. His expression shifted. It was a subtle change, but to Eleanor, who had spent years studying the tectonic plates of his moods, it was a seismic event. The hard line of his mouth softened. The corners of his eyes crinkled slightly. And then, a smile bloomed on his face. It was not his corporate smile, the sharp, predatory flash of teeth he gave to business rivals. It was not the polite, empty smile he gave her. This was a private, gentle smile. It was unguarded and real, and it was aimed entirely at the glowing screen of his phone. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. The coffee cup grew heavy in her hands. She recognized that smile. She remembered it from a decade ago, on a windswept beach in the Hamptons, when he had told her he loved her for the first time. She remembered it from their honeymoon in Italy, across a candlelit table, his eyes full of a future she had believed they would build together. It was a smile that had once been hers, a secret language between them, and now he was giving it away to a stranger made of light and pixels. Her heart began a low, painful drumming against her ribs. She placed her cup down on its saucer, her hand trembling so slightly that only she could feel it. The clink of porcelain was a sharp crack in the silence. Richard looked up, his smile vanishing as if it had never been there. His face became a mask of cool indifference once more. "What is it?" he asked, his tone laced with a faint annoyance, as if she had interrupted something important. "Nothing," she said, her voice a little too quiet. She looked at her own plate, at the perfect arrangement of fruit she had no appetite for. I was thinking about the surprise you mentioned." He picked up his coffee cup, taking a gulp. "Don't worry about it, Eleanor. You'll see it when everyone else does." He set the cup down and his thumb began to move again, typing a rapid response to whatever or whoever had made him smile. The intimacy was back, a closed circuit between him and the phone, leaving her completely outside of it. He was building a wall between them, one text message at a time. She wanted to scream. She wanted to march down the length of that absurdly long table, snatch the phone from his hand, and demand to know who was on the other side. Who was stealing her husband's smiles? But she was Eleanor Vance. Vances did not scream. They did not make scenes. They endured, they observed, and they held their poise like a shield. So she sat there silent and straight-backed and watched as her husband finished his secret conversation. He finally pushed his chair back, the sound scraping against the marble. "I have to go," he said, slipping the phone into his jacket pocket. He walked past her without a glance, his expensive cologne trailing in his wake, a scent she now associated with distance. He did not kiss her goodbye. He hadn't for years. The front door of the penthouse opened and closed with a soft, expensive click, and then she was alone. The silence he left behind was heavier than the silence before. It was filled with the ghost of that smile. Eleanor sat at the table for a long time, the sunlight moving across the floor, the coffee in her cup growing cold. The seed of hope from last night had not sprouted. Instead, it was being choked by a thick, ugly weed of suspicion. What kind of surprise was shared with a secret smile and a hidden message? Later that day, the feeling of unease followed her like a shadow. She walked through the silent rooms, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She tried to focus on her tasks for the ball, reviewing lists of donors and coordinating with the catering manager, but her mind kept drifting back to Richard's face. The smile. It was burned into her memory. She ended up in her dressing room, a space filled with designer gowns and racks of beautiful shoes. At her vanity, she opened her jewelry box. Emeralds, diamonds, pearls, gifts from Richard from the early years. They felt like relics from another lifetime, belonging to a different woman, a happier woman, a more naive woman. Her eyes fell upon a small, velvet-covered album on her dressing table. It was the only thing in the room that felt truly hers. She opened it to the first page. There was the black and white photograph of her great-grandmother, Amelia Vance, at the very first Starlight charity ball. And around her neck was the legend itself, the Vance Starlight, the magnificent cornflower sapphire, surrounded by a spray of diamonds. It seemed to shine even in the faded photograph, a beacon of a lost era. Her mother used to tell her stories about it, how it was said to hold the light of a captured star, how it represented the soul of their family. A wild, desperate thought took root in her mind. The surprise, the showstopper. Richard was a billionaire. He could buy anything. What if he had found it? What if after all these years he had tracked down the Vance Starlight and was bringing it home? The thought was so powerful, so intoxicating, that it almost pushed the morning's ugliness away. It would be the ultimate gesture. It would not just be a gift to her, but a restoration of her family's honor. It would prove that he understood what was truly important, what legacy meant. It would prove he still loved her. The hope, so wounded at breakfast, began to timidly unfurl once more. Perhaps she had misread the situation. Perhaps the smile was just about closing a difficult deal, the final confirmation that he had secured the necklace. The secrecy would be part of the grand reveal. It made sense. It had to make sense. She clung to this idea, this beautiful, shimmering possibility. It was a life raft in the cold ocean of her marriage. She spent the rest of the afternoon nursing this fragile hope, allowing it to warm her. Richard came home late, long after the city had lit up outside their windows. Eleanor was in the grand living area, pretending to read a book. She heard him walk down the hall towards his home office, his footsteps heavy and tired. She waited, expecting him to come and find her, perhaps with a knowing look, a hint of the excitement to come. But he didn't. The door to his office clicked shut. A while later, needing a glass of water, she walked quietly down the hallway. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of her steps. As she passed his office, she heard his voice through the heavy wood of the door. It was not loud, but it was distinct. It was not his commanding business tone. It was a lower, more conspiratorial voice, the kind one uses when sharing a secret. Driven by an impulse she didn't try to stop, Eleanor paused. She held her breath, her ear close to the door, feeling a flush of shame that was quickly overwhelmed by a desperate need to know. "Yes, the transfer went through this afternoon," Richard was saying. "I saw the confirmation." There was a pause. Absolutely, it has to be perfect. Eleanor's heart leaped. Perfect. He was talking about the surprise. He was talking about the necklace. Now about the delivery, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. It must be discreet. I don't want it coming through the main building reception. Use a private courier, straight to the suite I booked at the Carlisle. No name on the package, just the suite number. A cold finger traced its way down Eleanor's spine. A suite at the Carlisle? Why would he have a gift for her delivered to a different hotel? And why such intense secrecy? The word discreet landed like a stone in her stomach. A gift for a wife is presented, not smuggled. Then he said the words that made the floor seem to fall away beneath her. Just make sure Boucheron and Hayes understands. There can be no mistakes. The ball is in 2 days. She'll be absolutely thrilled. This will make her the star of the evening. Boucheron and Hayes, the jeweler her family had used for generations. The very house that had designed the Vance Starlight. And then, that final devastating pronoun. She. She will be thrilled. The way he said it, it was not the way a man talks about his wife. It was the way a man talks about a new and exciting discovery. A prize. The hope that Eleanor had so carefully nurtured all afternoon shattered into a million tiny, sharp pieces. It was not a life raft. It was an anchor, pulling her down into dark, freezing water. The smile at breakfast, the secret texts, the discreet delivery to a hotel suite. It all clicked into place, forming a picture of such profound and calculated cruelty that she could barely breathe. She heard his chair squeak inside the office, the sound of him getting up. She had to move. On numb legs, she backed away from the door, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle the sound that was trying to escape her throat. She retreated down the hall and into the shadows of the living room, her body moving on pure instinct. She stood by the window, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to hold herself together as her world came apart. The show-stopping surprise was not for her. The star of the evening would not be her. Richard had not bought back her family's legacy to honor her. He had bought it for someone else, someone who was waiting in a suite at the Carlisle, someone he wanted to make a star. He was going to parade this other woman, wearing Eleanor's history, her memory, her soul in front of the entire world at an event founded by her own grandmother. It wasn't just infidelity, it was a desecration. Eleanor stared out at the glittering expanse of New York City, a million lights winking in the darkness. Just hours ago, she had looked at them with a glimmer of hope. Now they seemed to be mocking her, each one a tiny cold eye watching her humiliation unfold. The knot of suspicion she had felt all day was no longer just a feeling. It had tightened and hardened into a cold, heavy certainty. Her hope for a beautiful surprise had curdled into the sickening dread of a public execution, and she was the one being led to the gallows. The knot of anxiety in Eleanor's chest had not loosened. It had simply settled, a cold, heavy weight in her soul. For days, she had been living with the ghost of a smile, the echo of a secret conversation. Richard's promise of a show-stopping surprise played over and over in her mind. At first, it was a spark of hope. Now it felt like a threat. She moved through the vast, silent penthouse, her own home, feeling like an unwelcome guest. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed a city alive with light and motion, but inside the air was still and sterile. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a week before the Starlight Ball. The sky was the color of slate, and a thin, persistent rain wept against the glass. Eleanor sat in the home study, a room Richard rarely used. It was her sanctuary, lined with her father's leather-bound books that smelled of paper and time. This was where she managed the household, a task she performed with the same quiet diligence she applied to everything. It was a vestige of her old life, a sense of control in a world that felt increasingly out of her hands. She clicked open the monthly statement for their primary household account. It was a routine she could do with her eyes closed: mortgage payment, utilities, staff salaries, groceries from the finest markets, all the predictable expenses of a life cushioned by immense wealth. She scrolled down the digital ledger, her finger tracing the cool surface of the tablet. The lines of text were a familiar, orderly river of numbers. Then her finger stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. A single line item stood out, stark and shocking against the mundane list. The merchant name was Boucheron and Hayes. It was a name from her childhood, a name whispered with reverence in her family. They were the jewelers who had served the Vances for 3 generations, the artisans who had crafted pieces for her grandmother. The Vances had not shopped there in decades, not since the lean years when family treasures had to be sold. And the amount. Eleanor had to read it twice, then a third time, her eyes struggling to process the string of zeros. It was not a few thousand or even a few 100,000. It was a charge for $7.5 million. The number seemed to pulsate on the screen, a venomous, living thing. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. $7.5 million. From a jeweler her family had once patronized, and Richard had only ever heard about in her wistful stories. This was not a casual purchase. This was a statement. This was an acquisition of something significant, something monumental. For a moment, the old hope flickered. Could it be? Could Richard, in some grand, misguided gesture, have found something for her, something to replace the lost legacy she mourned? The thought was a painful, beautiful fantasy. He knew the stories. He knew what the Vance Starlight necklace meant to her family's memory. Maybe his surprise was not cruel after all. Maybe it was the most romantic thing he had ever done. But the cold knot of dread in her stomach told her otherwise. Richard was not a romantic. He was a pragmatist, a conqueror. His gestures were about power, not sentiment. And the secrecy, the sly smiles at his phone, the hushed call with a jeweler. It did not feel like the prelude to a loving gift for his wife. It felt like a conspiracy. She sat there for a long time, the tablet resting on her lap, the glow of the screen illuminating her pale, still face. The rain tapped a nervous rhythm on the window pane. She knew she had to ask him. The not knowing was a special kind of torture, an acid eating away at her composure. She needed to see his face when she said the words. She needed to watch his eyes. That evening, Richard returned home later than usual. Eleanor heard the heavy click of the front door, his confident footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the foyer. She remained in the study, the tablet on the mahogany desk beside her. She had been rehearsing the question in her head for hours, trying to find a tone that was casual, not accusatory. She wanted to give him a chance to tell the truth. She wanted, more than anything, to be wrong. He appeared in the doorway, loosening the silk tie from around his neck. He looked handsome, powerful, energized by his day of corporate battles. A faint scent of expensive cologne and the crisp night air followed him into the room. He smiled when he saw her. It was his public smile, the one he used for photographers and business partners. It did not reach his eyes. "Still up, darling?" he asked, his voice smooth as velvet. "Burning the midnight oil over the grocery bills?" Eleanor managed a small, tight smile. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. "I was just finishing up," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Richard, I have a question for you." He tossed his tie onto a leather armchair and walked toward the small bar cart in the corner. "Ask away," he said, his back to her as he poured himself a glass of whiskey. The clink of the crystal decanter against the glass was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She took a slow, deliberate breath. "I was reviewing the household accounts today. There was a very large charge that came through." "Oh?" He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, still not looking at her. "How large is large? Did the caterers overcharge for that dreadful dinner party last month?" His tone was light, dismissive. "It was $7.5 million, Eleanor said. The swirling stopped. For a fraction of a second, his shoulders tensed. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible reaction, but she saw it. He took a slow sip of his whiskey before finally turning to face her. His expression was one of mild, practiced curiosity. $7.5 million? Are you sure? Must be a business expense that got miscategorized." "It was from Boucheron and Hayes," she stated, her gaze locked on his. She let the name hang in the air between them. The name of her family's jewelers. Richard's face remained a mask of detached calm. He even chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. "Ah, that," he said, as if suddenly remembering a trivial detail. He walked over and leaned against the edge of the desk, towering over her. "I should have told you. It was meant to be a surprise for the office." Eleanor's heart sank. The lie was coming, and she could feel its shape before he even spoke the words. A surprise from a jeweler? Not exactly, he said smoothly, taking another sip of his drink. I commissioned a sculpture for the main lobby at Sterling Corp headquarters. We have that big merger finalizing after the ball, and I wanted something iconic to mark the new era. He waved his hand vaguely. It's a huge abstract piece, metal and crystal. Boucheron's new art division handled the commission. Very exclusive. The lie was so effortless, so complete. It was plausible enough to deflect any casual inquiry. A billionaire buying an expensive sculpture for his corporate lobby was perfectly normal. But Eleanor knew. She knew in her bones. Boucheron and Hayes did not have an art division that sold massive lobby installations. They sold exquisite, intimate things. Things meant to be worn close to the skin. Things that shone under ballroom lights. They sold jewelry. Her mind raced. An abstract sculpture. It was a lie designed to make her feel foolish for even asking, for meddling in the important world of his business. It was a wall he had just built between them, brick by condescending brick. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze any longer. The truth was there, in his easy denial, in the way he used a business excuse to cover a deeply personal purchase. A sculpture, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The sound was hollow in the quiet room. She felt a profound sense of foolishness, not for asking, but for ever holding on to that tiny sliver of hope. He wasn't buying back her family's legacy for her. He was using her family's jeweler for someone else. Exactly, Richard said, his voice bright and final, the tone of a discussion now closed. He finished his whiskey and placed the empty glass on the desk with a soft click. It's all just boring business, Eleanor. Nothing for you to worry about. She finally looked up at him. His eyes were cool, unreadable. There was no warmth in them, no shared intimacy. She was looking at a stranger, a handsome, charming stranger who shared her home and her life, but whose heart was a locked room. The dread she had been feeling for days solidified into something hard and cold as ice. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. He was lying to her about something enormous, something that cost millions and involved a jeweler from her past. And he expected her to simply accept his flimsy story and look the other way. He reached out, his hand cool against her skin. He didn't take her hand or touch her cheek. Instead, he patted her on the head, a slow, deliberate gesture. Once, twice. It was the way one would pat a child, the way one would soothe a simple-minded pet. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it, he said again, his voice now laced with a soft, cutting condescension. He smiled his perfect, empty smile one last time. I have to make a few calls before I turn in, he said, already moving toward the door. Big day tomorrow. Eleanor didn't move. She sat frozen in her chair, the feeling of his hand lingering on her hair like a brand. The touch was not affectionate. It was an assertion of power, a dismissal. He had looked at her, seen her fear and her suspicion, and he had dismissed it all with a light bun and a pat on the head. He thought she was a fool, an oblivious, decorative wife whose only role was to manage household accounts and not ask too many questions. The door to the study clicked shut, leaving her alone in the silent room filled with her family's history. The echo of his footsteps faded down the hall. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cold cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, crystalline humiliation. The dread was no longer a vague anxiety. It had a name, a price tag, and a patronizing touch. And it was just the beginning. The heavy silence of the penthouse was a physical weight. It pressed down on Eleanor, a suffocating blanket woven from glass, steel, and unspoken words. The front door had clicked shut nearly an hour ago. The sound had echoed through the cavernous living room, a final sharp punctuation to an evening of quiet fractures. Richard was gone. Gone to a last-minute meeting, he had said. His voice was rushed, his eyes already distant, focused on a world beyond their shared walls. He had kissed her cheek, a dry, papery touch that felt more like a formality than an act of affection. And in his haste, he had forgotten something. Eleanor stood in the grand hallway, her silk robe a whisper of sound against the cold marble floor. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, a futile attempt to hold in the tremor that had started in her hands and was now spreading through her entire body. She stared at the closed door to his study. The wood was a dark, polished mahogany, a surface so perfect it reflected a distorted, elongated version of her own form. She looked like a ghost haunting her own home. The air still carried the faint, sharp scent of his cologne, a ghost of his presence. It mingled with the sterile, citrus scent of the cleaning products the staff used, creating a perfume of absence. His words from earlier echoed in her mind, a cruel loop of condescension. Don't worry your pretty little head about it. The memory was a fresh sting, a hot flush of humiliation that climbed her neck. He had patted her head, as if she were a child, as if she were a decorative pet, something to be placated and dismissed. For years she had accepted his ambition, his drive. She had mistaken his relentless focus for passion, his secrecy for the necessary armor of a man conquering the world. She had been his partner, the steady, quiet force that gave him the one thing his billions could not buy: legitimacy, the Vance name. And in return, he had patted her on the head. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, a tiny, salty protest against the cold perfection of the marble. This wasn't just about a suspicious charge on an account. It wasn't just about a layup, however smooth. It was about the slow, chilling realization that she had become invisible in her own life. A beautiful, well-maintained piece of furniture in the house he had built. Her gaze remained fixed on the study door. Behind it, on the gleaming surface of his antique partner's desk, sat his tablet. She had seen it as he rushed out, a sleek slate of dark gray against the rich red-brown of the wood. He never went anywhere without it. It was his lifeline, his second brain, the digital extension of his will. For him to forget it was more than an oversight. It was an anomaly, a crack in the flawless facade of his control. She took a step toward the door, then stopped. Her bare feet were cold on the floor. A war raged within her. Every rule she had ever lived by, every principle instilled in her since childhood, screamed at her to turn around. A Vance does not stoop. A Vance does not snoop. Privacy was sacrosanct, a cornerstone of civilized behavior. To cross that threshold, to touch his private things, was to become someone she did not recognize, someone suspicious, someone small, the kind of wife she had always pitied in whispered conversations at luncheons. But another voice, a deeper and more primal one, urged her forward. It was the same intuition that had made the hairs on her arms stand up when he smiled at his phone. The same gut-wrenching dread that had coiled in her stomach when he lied about the jeweler. This voice didn't care about decorum. It cared about the truth. It whispered that not knowing was a slow poison, and she was already dying from it. What was worse? To break a rule of etiquette, or to live a lie so profound it hollowed out your soul? Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. It was cold and heavy, solid brass. She expected it to be locked. He was a man who locked everything, from his car to his office to the impenetrable vaults of his emotions. But the knob turned with a soft, well-oiled click. The door swung inward without a sound, opening into the deep shadows of the study. The room smelled of old leather, paper, and Richard's lingering cologne. It was his sanctuary, the one place in the penthouse that felt truly his. The walls were lined with books he never read, their leather spines chosen by a decorator for their color and texture. A single lamp was on, casting a warm golden pool of light on the massive desk, illuminating the tablet at its center. It was like a spotlight on a stage, the only thing in the entire room that seemed to matter. Eleanor stood just inside the doorway, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The city outside was a distant, glittering tapestry of light, viewed through the floor-to-ceiling window behind the desk. But she didn't see it. All she saw was that simple, dark rectangle of glass and metal. It held answers. It held the truth about the 8-figure charge. It held the truth about the secret smile. It held the truth about the show-stopping surprise he had planned for the ball. Her ball. She thought of her grandmother, the woman who had founded the Starlight Charity Ball. She could almost picture her, regal and composed, her eyes full of a gentle but unyielding strength. What would she have done? Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut. Her grandmother would never have found herself in this position. Her husband had adored her. He had built a life around her, not just alongside her. The comparison was a fresh wave of pain. She forced her eyes open. The pain was clarifying. It burned away the fog of indecision. She was not her grandmother. This was not her grandmother's life. This was hers. And it was fracturing right before her eyes. The dignity she was so desperate to preserve felt like a sham if it was built on a foundation of deceit. True dignity was not about ignoring a fire. It was about walking into the smoke to see how far it had spread. Slowly she walked across the plush Persian rug, her footsteps silenced by the thick pile. Each step felt heavy, irreversible. She was crossing a line, and she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that she could never go back. When she reached the desk, she stopped. She looked down at the tablet. The screen was black, a void. It reflected her own face, pale and strained in the lamplight. She saw the ghost again, frightened, alone. For a long moment, she just stood there, breathing in the scent of his world. She ran her fingers along the edge of the desk, the wood cool and smooth beneath her touch. She had helped him choose this desk. They had been in an antique shop downtown years ago. He had been so excited, his voice full of plans for the empire he was going to build. He had taken her hand and told her, "We'll do it together, Eleanor, you and me." Where was that man now? Had he ever really existed? Her hand hovered over the tablet, shaking so badly she had to clench it into a fist. This felt like a betrayal, a violation of the trust she had so freely given him for 12 years. But hadn't he betrayed her first? The lie about the sculpture wasn't just a lie. It was an insult to her intelligence. The condescending pat on her head was an insult to her personhood. Her love, her family name, her very identity had been assets he'd acquired. And assets, she knew from watching him in business, could be devalued and liquidated. She had to know her own worth. She had to know what she was facing. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to pull all the cold air from the room into her lungs, she reached out. Her fingers, still trembling, made contact with the cool glass. She picked it up. It felt heavier than it looked, weighted with secrets. The screen remained dark. She pressed a small button on the side. The screen flickered to life, bathing her face in a sterile white glow. It displayed the time, the date, and a prompt. A fingerprint icon pulsed softly at the bottom of the screen. Of course, it was locked. A wall, just as she expected. A wave of something that felt strangely like relief washed over her arm, quickly followed by a new surge of frustration. She was so close. The answers were right there, sealed away behind his digital fingerprint. She stared at the icon, a stylized swirl that represented him, his identity, his security. She could put it down. She could walk away. She could return to the cold comfort of her deniability, pretend she had never come into this room. She could go on being the perfect, unsuspecting wife. She could go to the ball and smile for the cameras, waiting for his show-stopping surprise, whatever fresh humiliation it might be. Or she could try. It was an insane thought, illogical, futile. Why would her fingerprint be registered on his most private device? He kept his world and hers meticulously separate. His business was his. Their social life was hers. That was the unspoken arrangement. He had his secrets, and she had her dignity. But the image of him patting her head flashed in her mind again. The casual, dismissive arrogance of it. The complete certainty that she would never challenge him, never question him, never dare to look behind the curtain. A spark of defiance ignited within her. It was a cold, hard flame. She would not be dismissed. Her thumb moved, almost of its own accord. It was a gesture of pure, desperate symbolism. A final, hopeless push against the wall he had built between them. She wasn't expecting it to work. She was expecting the cold buzz of rejection, the mocking try-again message that would confirm her status as an outsider. She pressed her thumb firmly against the glowing icon on the screen. She held her breath, waiting for the failure. There was a soft click. A subtle vibration ran through the device in her hands. And to her utter, heart-stopping shock, the lock screen vanished. The tablet unlocked. The screen glowed with a cold, impersonal light. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Eleanor did nothing. She simply stood in the oppressive silence of Richard's study, her thumbprint a ghostly smudge on the glass of his tablet. It was unlocked. The final barrier between her gnawing suspicion and a truth she was terrified to face had simply vanished. Her own body had betrayed her, her thumb moving with an instinct she did not recognize, opening a door she had promised herself she would never even approach. The air in the room was sterile, smelling faintly of leather and wood polish, a scent she once found comforting. Now it felt like the scent of a mausoleum. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm in the tomb-like quiet. On the screen, a grid of applications stared back at her, neat and orderly, just like Richard. Most were for business, finance, stocks. But one icon held her gaze, the simple white envelope of the mail application. A small, blood-red circle was perched on its corner, displaying the number 7. 7 unread messages, 7 potential daggers. A part of her, the part that was her mother's daughter, dreamed to put the device down, to walk away, to preserve the fragile shell of her dignity, to choose ignorance over this vulgar, desperate act. Vance did not snoop. Vance did not lower herself. But another voice, a deeper, more primal one, whispered that her dignity was already a casualty. It had been dying a slow death for years. In every dismissive comment, every late night, every cold shoulder in their cavernous bed. That voice demanded the truth. It was a debt owed to her own sanity. Her hand trembled, not from cold, but from a profound, soul-deep dread. She drew a shaky breath, and with a finger that felt disconnected from her body, she tapped the mail icon. The screen refreshed, displaying a list of incoming messages. The top few were exactly what she expected. Subject lines about quarterly reports, merger logistics, market analysis from Sterling Corp. For a dizzying second, relief washed over her. It was foolish. She was being paranoid, hysterical. He was just a busy, ambitious man. She was just a lonely, imaginative wife. She almost laughed at herself, a choked, bitter sound. Then she saw it. Further down the list, nestled between a message from his legal team and a market summary, was a name that meant nothing and everything. Chloe B. It was not just one email. It was a conversation thread, a long chain of replies, the most recent one marked as unread. The subject line was deceptively simple. Thinking of you. It was not a business email. It was not about mergers or markets. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The trembling in her hand intensified, making the tablet feel impossibly heavy. She knew with a certainty that was absolute and sickening, that this was it. This was the abyss she had been circling. She tapped the thread. The screen filled with a history of correspondence. A secret world unfolded before her eyes, written in the casual, intimate shorthand of lovers. Her eyes scanned the words, each one a fresh wound. From Richard, I'm stuck in this board meeting. All I can think about is your laugh. A reply from Chloe B. Poor you. Wish I was there to make it better. I'm still wearing the bracelet. I haven't taken it off. Eleanor's mind flashed to a week ago. Richard had claimed to be in an all-day negotiation with a German firm. He had come home exhausted, irritable, waving off her questions. He had been thinking of another woman's laugh. He had bought another woman a bracelet. She kept reading, scrolling upwards, backwards in time, devouring the evidence of her own irrelevance. The emails spanned months. They were filled with private jokes, shared memories, and plans for clandestine meetings disguised as business trips. Richard, that weekend in Tuscany was everything. We have to go back. Chloe, photo attached to remember our little escape. Don't let the dragon see it. The dragon, the casual cruelty of the nickname stole Eleanor's breath. Was that what she was to them? A mythical beast guarding a treasure he no longer wanted? With a shaking finger, she tapped the attachment. An image loaded, painfully clear and bright on the high-resolution screen. It was Richard and a young woman, posed on a sun-drenched balcony overlooking rolling green hills. Richard had his arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. He was smiling. Not his polished public smile for the cameras, but a genuine, unguarded grin of pure happiness. The kind of smile he had given her on their wedding day, a smile she had not seen directed at her in years. The woman, Chloe, was beautiful. Of course she was. She was young, with long, dark hair falling over her shoulders and a vibrant, artless smile. She was leaning into Richard, her head resting against his chest, looking up at him with undisguised adoration. She wore a simple white sundress, and she looked effervescent, alive, utterly carefree. Eleanor stared at the photo, at the two of them looking so perfectly, painfully happy. She felt 1,000 years old. She thought of herself in their cold, silent penthouse, coordinating charity events and managing a household staff, living a life of quiet, aesthetic perfection, a life that was apparently a prison from which he needed to escape. She clicked back to the email thread, a glutton for punishment. More photos. Richard and Chloe on a sailboat, sea spray in their hair, his hand on her knee. Richard and Chloe clinking glasses of red wine in what looked like a cozy rustic restaurant, their faces close together. Each picture was a confirmation of a lie he had told her. The solo fishing trip to recharge. The investor summit in Rome. Her entire reality for the past year was a carefully constructed fiction, and she was the only one who hadn't known the script. The words blurred through the hot tears welling in her eyes. She did not let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction, even in absentia. She scrolled down, down, down through the sickeningly sweet history of their affair until she reached the bottom. The most recent emails, the unread ones. Her finger hovered over the top one, sent just that afternoon from Richard's account. The subject line was just 2 words: the surprise. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the pit of her stomach. This was his show-stopping surprise for the ball. Not for her, never for her. It was for Chloe, for the girl in the pictures, the girl he escaped to, the girl he called when he was bored in meetings. Her breath hitched. She had to know. She had to see the full scope of his betrayal. She tapped the email. It was short. The text was almost clinical, but the implication was devastating. "It's done," Richard had written. "Picked it up this afternoon. The jeweler was incredibly discreet, just as we planned. You are going to be the most beautiful woman at the ball, the only one anyone will look at. See attached for the final confirmation." Attached, just like the photos. Another file? It was a PDF. Eleanor's eyes fixed on the file name. B&H Invoice Final. B&H, Boucheron and Hayes, the jeweler from the credit card statement. The lie about the abstract sculpture echoed in her mind, loud and mocking. He had looked her right in the eye and patted her on the head like a child, telling her not to worry, while he was buying a multi-million-dollar gift for his mistress. She opened the file. Her world tilted on its axis. An official invoice materialized on the screen, bearing the elegant, familiar crest of Boucheron and Hayes. It was the same crest that had been on the velvet boxes holding her family's jewelry for generations. Her eyes scanned the document, her brain struggling to process the information. The date was today. The client name was Richard Sterling. The amount was a staggering figure, a number so large it seemed unreal. But it was not the price that made her vision swim. It was the item description. 1-1 historical piece. The Vance Starlight, vintage platinum necklace featuring a 37-carat royal blue cornflower sapphire centerpiece, surrounded by a cascading starburst of antique-cut diamonds. From the private collection of Lord Ashworth. The Vance Starlight, her necklace, her great-grandmother's necklace, the symbol of her family's legacy, its past glory, its painful sacrifices. The piece she dreamed of one day recovering. He had found it. He had found the Vance Starlight. A wild, desperate hope flared in her chest for a fraction of a second. Maybe this was for her. Maybe this was the grand romantic gesture she had stopped letting herself wish for. Maybe he remembered her stories, the ache in her voice when she spoke of it. Maybe he did love her after all. The hope died as quickly as it came, extinguished by the final, cruelest piece of the puzzle. She scrolled down past the invoice details, past the wire transfer confirmation. At the very bottom of the page, set apart in a small, tasteful box, were the words, "Gift note enclosed." And beneath it, the message he had written. The message meant for Chloe. "For Chloe, the only star in my sky. Can't wait to see you shine at the ball." The words burned themselves into her spiritus. The only star in my sky. He had taken the name of her family's most cherished heirloom, the Starlight, and twisted it into a cheap, romantic line for his young lover. He was not just giving her a gift. He was giving her Eleanor's history. He was planning to have his mistress parade her family's soul around her neck at her family's charity ball. The ball founded by the very woman who had first worn that necklace. It was not just infidelity. It was not just a betrayal. It was a desecration, a calculated act of psychological annihilation. He was not just cheating on her. He was erasing her. He was taking her legacy, the one thing she had that he could never buy, and handing it to someone else as a bauble. The humiliation he had planned was so profound, so complete, it was almost a work of art. The strength went out of her arms. Her fingers went numb, losing their grip. The tablet slipped from her grasp. It seemed to fall in slow motion, turning end over end through the silent air before it met the cold marble floor of the study. The sound was not a loud crash, but a sharp, sickening clatter that echoed in the stillness. It was the only sound in the room. A terrible, silent scream was trapped in Eleanor's throat, a pressure building in her chest so immense she thought her ribs would crack. Her hand flew to her mouth, but no sound came out. There was only the image of the gift note, burning behind her eyes, and the deafening sound of her entire world shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The sharp clatter of the tablet hitting the marble floor echoed in a room that had suddenly become a tomb. For a moment, Eleanor Vance did not move. She simply stood, a statue of disbelief, her hands still outstretched, as if she could pull the device back from its fall, back into a time before. Before the emails, before the pictures, before the name Chloe, before the receipt that felt like a death certificate for her marriage, for her history, for a part of her soul she didn't even know was still vulnerable. The sound faded, swallowed by the thick carpets and the heavy silence of the penthouse. The only noise left was a faint, high-pitched ringing in her ears. A silent scream had tried to escape her throat, but it had died there, choked by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Her breath came in ragged, shallow little gasps. Her lungs felt like they were lined with broken glass. Slowly, as if her bones were dissolving, her knees gave way. She didn't fall so much as she folded, collapsing onto the cold floor of Richard's study. Her cheek pressed against the smooth, unyielding marble. It was cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the fire raging through her veins. Dust motes danced in the slanted shafts of moonlight, cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the city pulsed with life, a million stories unfolding under the night sky. But in here, Eleanor's world had contracted to this single suffocating room, to the dark screen of the tablet, lying just inches from her face. A tremor started in her hands and spread through her entire body. It was a deep internal quake, a seismic shock that shook the very foundations of the woman she thought she was. Then came the tears. They were not gentle or cathartic. They were violent, silent sobs that racked her frame, each one a physical blow. Her shoulders heaved, but no sound came out. It was the grief of a lifetime, for a decade of a life she now understood was a carefully constructed lie. Every anniversary dinner, every shared smile, every whispered promise in the dark. It all replayed in her mind, now tainted, grotesque, a film strip burning at the edges. Her mind, a traitor seeking refuge in the past, flew back to her wedding day. She saw Richard standing at the altar, his eyes locked on hers. He had looked so sincere, so overwhelmed with love. His voice, when he spoke his vows, had been thick with emotion. He promised to honor her, to cherish her, to be her partner in all things, her sanctuary. He had taken her hands, his touch so warm and sure, and told her that, with her, he had finally come home. She had believed him. She had built her entire world upon the bedrock of those promises. Now that bedrock had turned to sand, and she was sinking. The memory dissolved, replaced by another softer one. She was a little girl sitting on her mother's bed. Her mother was holding a velvet box, her voice filled with a gentle reverence. She was telling the story of the Vance Starlight. It wasn't just a necklace. It was a promise passed from one generation to the next. Her great-grandfather had commissioned it for his wife, a woman who had stood by him through hardship and triumph. The sapphire was the color of her eyes, her mother had said, and the diamonds were the fire of her spirit. Eleanor could almost smell her mother's perfume, that familiar scent of roses and old books. She could hear her voice, a low melodic hum. The necklace was sold during the Great Crash, a sacrifice to keep the family afloat. It was a wound in their history, a painful reminder of what could be lost. But her mother had always finished the story with a note of hope. One day, she would say, when their fortunes were restored, they would find it. They would bring it home. It was more than jewelry. It was their legacy. It was resilience cast in platinum and stone. And Richard had known. He had known every word of that story. She had told it to him herself one rainy afternoon, years ago, when they were still learning the intimate architecture of each other's lives. He had listened, his expression serious, and held her close. He had understood its weight. He had understood what it represented. And he had taken that sacred story, that piece of her family's heart, and he had bought it. Not for her, not to heal that old family wound, but as a trinket, a trophy for his young mistress, a weapon to be used against Eleanor herself. The thought was a physical spike of pain, driving the air from her lungs again. He wasn't just cheating on her. That was a common, vulgar crime. This was different. This was a targeted act of profound cruelty. It was a desecration. He had taken the most sacred symbol of her heritage and given it to the woman he was using to betray her. He planned to have that woman wear it to the Starlight Ball, an event founded by Eleanor's own grandmother, in front of everyone, in front of the whole world. The humiliation was the point. He wanted to show everyone that he owned it all now. He owned the company, he owned the penthouse, and he even owned her family's past. He could take its most precious artifact and hang it around the neck of a stranger, and she, Eleanor Vance Sterling, would have to stand there and smile. The perfect, poised wife, the silent partner in her own debasement. A new feeling began to stir beneath the crushing weight of her grief. It was something dark and cold, moving slowly through her veins like liquid nitrogen. The hot tears of sorrow began to feel different on her skin. They felt like a weakness she could no longer afford. The shuddering sobs subsided, replaced by a stillness that was far more terrifying. Her mind flashed to another memory, a more recent one, just yesterday. Richard standing in the doorway, telling her not to worry her pretty little head about the jeweler's bill. The condescending pat on her head, the dismissive smile. He hadn't seen her as a partner. He hadn't even seen her as a person. He saw her as a decoration, an accessory that came with a good name, a piece of the set he had assembled for his perfect life, an object just like the abstract sculpture he had lied about buying. The coldness in her veins began to solidify. It wasn't grief anymore. It was something harder, something with a sharp and unforgiving edge. It was rage, pure, clean, and absolute. A rage so potent it burned away the sorrow, leaving behind a terrible clarity. The world didn't feel broken anymore. It felt sharp. The edges of the desk, the lines of the bookshelves, the distant grid of city lights. Everything came into focus with a crystalline precision. He had miscalculated. He had assumed her gentility was weakness. He thought her quiet dignity was passivity. He believed that because she was from old money, she lacked the hunger, the ruthlessness that had made him a billionaire. He had forgotten, or perhaps he had never known, that the Vances had not built their legacy on politeness. They had built it on strength. They had survived crashes and wars and betrayals far greater than his cheap affair. That resilience wasn't just in a necklace. It was in her blood. Slowly, Eleanor pushed her palms against the cold marble. Her arms trembled, not with grief now, but with a burgeoning strength. She pushed herself up from the floor, first to her knees, then, unsteadily, to her feet. Her silk blouse was creased, her face stained with tears, her hair falling from its elegant chignon. She was a mess, a wreck. But as she stood there, breathing evenly, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she did not feel weak. She felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over her. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache in her chest. But it was no longer her master. It was now her fuel. The love she had felt for Richard, the trust she had placed in him, had been incinerated. And from those ashes, something new and formidable was rising. She walked out of the study, her footsteps silent, on the plush runner in the hallway. She didn't look back at the tablet, the digital oracle that had delivered her ruin and her rebirth. It was just an object now. The evidence it held was what mattered. She walked into the master bedroom, a vast, sterile space that had felt empty even when Richard was in it. She stopped in front of the enormous, antique silver mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her face pale and streaked with dried tears. She looked haunted, broken. But as she held her own gaze, she saw something else flicker to life in the stormy gray depths. It was a spark, a glint of steel. The victim who had collapsed on the floor of the study was gone. The woman staring back at her now was different. Her jaw was set, her spine was straight. The tears were just residue from a battle that was already over. A new war was about to begin. She looked at her tear-streaked face in the reflection, and she saw not a victim, but a woman with nothing left to lose. The reflection in the darkened window was no longer a stranger. The woman staring back was not the weeping wife who had collapsed on the cold marble floor. Her face was pale, a stark canvas for the stormy gray of her eyes. The tears had dried, leaving behind a faint, salty tightness on her skin. Grief was a fire that had burned through her, leaving not ash, but something hard and clear, like glass forged in a furnace. The pain was still there, a low, deep hum beneath her ribs, but it was no longer a weakness. It was a compass needle, and it was pointing north, towards war. She pushed herself up from the floor. Her movements were not rushed or frantic. They were deliberate, measured, as if every muscle was now under the command of a new and formidable general. The silence of the penthouse was immense. It was the kind of quiet that only obscene amounts of money could buy. A soundproof tomb high above the living, breathing city. Tonight, that silence felt different. It was not peaceful, it was tactical. It was the held breath before the ambush. Her gaze fell upon the tablet lying near the leg of the mahogany desk. Its screen was dark, a blank slate that had, only moments ago, held the complete annihilation of her world. She did not shudder at the sight of it. She walked towards it, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wood of the study. She knelt, not in defeat, but with the grace of a predator. Her fingers, which had been trembling, were now perfectly still as she picked it up. The metal and glass felt cool and impersonal, an object of pure function, and she would use it for exactly that. She sat in Richard's large leather chair, the seat still holding the faint warmth of his absence. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. This chair, this desk, this entire life he had built was a stage, and she had been his most convincing prop. She pressed her thumb to the screen. It lit up, revealing the open email application, the evidence of his treachery still glowing innocently. Chloe? The name was like a shard of glass under her tongue. She scrolled through the messages again, but this time there was no emotional sting. She was a forensic scientist examining a crime scene. She saw the photograph of them in Paris, Chloe laughing with her head thrown back, the Eiffel Tower twinkling behind them. A trip he had claimed was a solo venture to secure European funding. She saw the messages filled with cheap, breathless declarations of love, words he had once whispered to Eleanor in the dark, now recycled and offered to someone new. Each one was a small, precise incision, but she did not bleed. She cataloged. Then she found the final email again, the receipt from Boucheron and Hayes, the Vance Starlight necklace, and the attached note. For Chloe, the only star in my sky, a cold, clear thought surfaced in her mind. He was not just cheating on her. He was trying to erase her. He was taking her family's history, a legacy of powerful, respected women, and placing it around the neck of his mistress. It was an act of profound symbolic violence. He wanted to show the world, their world, that he owned not just her present, but also her past. He wanted to prove that the Vance name was now just another one of his assets, to be spent and displayed as he saw fit. A flicker of the old pain returned, a memory of her mother telling her stories about the necklace, about her great-grandmother wearing it at a state dinner, a symbol of resilience after a great war. The jewel was not just a stone, it was crystallized history, it was honor. And Richard was giving it to a girl who likely thought history was something you cleared from a web browser. Eleanor's fingers moved with speed and precision across the screen. She opened a new browser tab. She created a new, secure email account. The name she chose was a simple, anonymous string of letters and numbers. It had no sentiment, no history. It was a digital lockbox. One by one, she began to forward the emails, the intimate exchanges, the travel itineraries, the photographs, and finally the receipt from the jeweler, complete with the gift note. She sent them all to the new address, creating a mirror image of his betrayal, an archive of his crimes that now belonged only to her. She checked to ensure they had all arrived. They had. Then, with the same methodical calm, she went into his sent folder and deleted the forwarded messages. She went into her new account on the tablet and logged out. She cleared the browser history. She closed all the applications. When she was finished, the tablet screen showed only the pristine, corporate-approved background image of a mountain range. It was a blank slate once more, an innocent object. She placed the tablet back on the desk, exactly where Richard had left it. She stood up and walked out of the study, closing the door softly behind her. The air in the living room was cool against her skin. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Manhattan glittered, a galaxy of strangers, each with their own dramas, their own heartbreaks. For a moment, she felt utterly alone, an island in the sky, but the feeling passed. She was not alone. She had allies she had not spoken to in years. She had a name that still held weight in rooms Richard could not enter without her. She walked to the console table in the hallway and picked up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, past the names of society hostesses, charity board members, and personal shoppers. Her finger stopped on a name she had not needed to call for help in a very long time. Thomas, her brother. She pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear. It rang twice. "Eleanor, is everything all right? It's late." His voice came through, warm and familiar, a sound from a life before Richard. She took a breath. Her own voice, when she spoke, surprised her. It was low, steady, and completely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a stranger. "Thomas, it's me." There was a pause on the other end. He could already hear it. The change, the fracture. "Ellie, what is it? What's wrong?" "I need you," she said, the words flat and hard. "I'm at the penthouse. He's crossed a line we can't come back from." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The finality in her tone was enough. The words "we can't come back from" hung in the air between them, absolute and unbreakable. She heard a sharp intake of breath on his end, followed by the sound of rustling papers, of a man suddenly in motion. "Richard?" he asked, his voice now tight with a protective anger she knew so well. "Yes," she said, just that one word. "What did he do?" "It's better if I show you," Eleanor replied. "It's comprehensive." Another pause, shorter this time. He understood. This was not a tearful confession of a minor marital spat. This was a declaration of war. "Are you safe?" he asked, the lawyer in him giving way to the older brother. "He's not here," she said, "and I am perfectly safe." She felt a strange truth in those words. She had never been safer because she had never been more dangerous. The fear was gone. "All right," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a grim, professional register. "Listen to me. Don't speak to him if he comes back. Don't text him. Don't do anything. I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "I won't," she promised. "I mean it, Eleanor. Whatever it is, we handle it together. From now on, nothing happens without me knowing." "I understand, Thomas. I'll see you soon." She ended the call and placed the phone back on the table. 20 minutes. She had 20 minutes to prepare. She turned and walked not to her bedroom, but to the small library at the far end of the penthouse. This was her space, the one room Richard rarely entered. He called it dusty. It was filled with her family's books, first editions bound in leather and cloth, smelling of old paper and history. He had no use for it. He preferred his information delivered on a screen, new and disposable. She went to a locked-down cabinet made of dark cherry wood, a piece her father had given her. She unlocked it with a small, antique silver key she wore on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her clothes. Richard had never even noticed it. Inside were not jewels or cash, but something far more valuable. She pulled out a set of thick, leather-bound ledgers, their covers embossed with a simple, elegant V. The Vance family records dating back 3 generations. She laid them open on the polished surface of a reading table. The pages were filled with her grandfather's sharp, decisive handwriting. Names of people, companies, banks. Records of loans given, favors done, Partnerships forged with a handshake in a quiet club downtown. These were the foundations upon which her family's influence had been built. It was a world of trust, honor, and long memory. A world Richard, with his hostile takeovers and leveraged buyouts, fundamentally misunderstood. He thought old money was sleepy, that it had lost its teeth. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Her fingers traced a line of faded ink. She saw the name of a federal judge whose father her grandfather had helped through law school. She saw the name of the patriarch of a media empire, who owed his first broadcasting license to a quiet word from Vance. She saw notes from the early 2000s detailing the formation of the Vance Seed Fund. It was an initiative her father started to invest in promising new ventures. And then she saw it, a single entry from 12 years ago, an initial seed investment of $5 million. The recipient company was a fledgling tech startup named Sterling Dynamics. Her breath caught in her throat. She had forgotten. In the haze of courtship and new love, she had completely forgotten this detail. Her family's money was the soil from which Richard's empire had first grown. He had taken their legacy, their trust, and their capital, and used it to build the weapon he was now pointing at her heart. A slow, cold smile touched Eleanor's lips. It did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were fixed on the entry in the ledger, the elegant script detailing the terms of the investment, a clause about maintaining the integrity and honor of the partnership, a clause Richard had undoubtedly dismissed as sentimental nonsense from a bygone era. She pulled out another book, a smaller one bound in dark blue leather, her father's personal address book. It was filled with names and private phone numbers that were not listed anywhere else. These were not business contacts. These were allies, people bound to the Vance family by decades of mutual respect and shared history. People who understood that a debt of honor was more binding than any legal contract. She began to turn the pages, her mind racing, connecting the names in the ledger to the numbers in the book. A plan began to form, not a vague desire for revenge, but a precise, multi-pronged strategy. One front would be legal, financial, a surgical strike designed to sever the roots of his company. The other front would be social, public, a systematic dismantling of the reputation he had paid so dearly to acquire. He had wanted to humiliate her at the Starlight Ball, the event her grandmother had founded. He wanted to use her family's stage to display his triumph. She would let him. She would hand him the microphone herself, just before she burned the entire stage to the ground. The faint sound of the private elevator chiming in the foyer broke her concentration. Thomas was here. She closed the ledgers and the address book, leaving them on the table. She walked out of the library to meet him, her posture erect, her hands steady. The battle was about to begin. Her brother would bring the law. She would bring the history. And together they would bring Richard Sterling's world crashing down. His voice, when he had agreed to come, had been grim with concern. He was worried about his broken-hearted sister. He was about to meet the woman she had become instead. The city lights smeared against the glass of the town car, a watercolor painting of a life she no longer recognized. Each gleaming window in each towering skyscraper felt like an eye, watching her. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, a statue of composure carved from ice. The driver, a man who had served her family for 20 years, occasionally glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression a mixture of deference and concern. He said nothing. He knew the Vances. He knew when silence was the only appropriate response. She was on her way to see her brother, but it felt more like she was on her way to a declaration of war. The penthouse behind her was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, a place where a decade of her life had been exposed as a fraud. The rage that had crystallized in her veins was now a quiet, cold engine, propelling her forward. There were no more tears left. Grief had been burned away, leaving behind something harder, something far more dangerous. Thomas's office was on the 47th floor of a granite and steel tower that predated Richard's entire existence. Unlike the cold, minimalist expanse of her penthouse, this place was a sanctuary of old money and quiet power. The air smelled of aged leather, old paper, and the faint, clean scent of lemon oil used on the mahogany paneling. The silence was deep, insulated, broken only by the distant, muffled hum of the city far below. It was a fortress, her family's fortress. Thomas was waiting for her, standing by the vast window that overlooked the tangle of Wall Street. He turned as she entered, and his face, so like her own, but etched with a protective severity, softened for a fraction of a second. He saw the stillness in her, the unnerving calm, and his jaw tightened. He knew this look. It was the look their father had worn the day he sold the company his own father had built. It was the look of absolute final resolve. He said nothing, simply gesturing to the two deep leather armchairs facing his immense desk. He walked to a polished wood cabinet, its glass front revealing a collection of crystal decanters. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a pair of heavy glasses without asking. He knew what she needed. He placed one in her hand. Her fingers, which had felt numb for hours, barely registered the cold weight of the glass. She didn't drink. She just held it, a solid, grounding presence in a world that had turned to smoke. Thomas sat opposite her, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his tie slightly loosened. He waited. He gave her the dignity of telling her story in her own time. The silence stretched, filled only by the quiet clink of ice in his glass. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice a low, steady monotone that betrayed no emotion at all. It was more terrifying than any scream. He bought it, Thomas. Thomas didn't need to ask what it was. There was only one thing it could be. His eyes, a stormy gray just like hers, darkened. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. For an answer, Eleanor reached into her handbag and pulled out Richard's tablet. She placed it on the polished surface of the desk between them, not with a clatter, but with a quiet, deliberate precision, as if she were placing a piece of evidence on a courtroom rail. "His password was our anniversary," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The irony is almost poetic. She slid the tablet across the desk. Thomas picked it up, his large, capable hands looking alien against the sleek, modern device. Eleanor watched his face as he navigated to the email she had left open. She saw the flicker of disbelief, followed by a wave of cold fury that settled over his features like a mask. He read the intimate exchanges between Richard and the girl, Chloe. His expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw began to tick violently. Then he reached the final email, the receipt from Boucheron and Hayes, the line item that read Vance Starlight necklace, and beneath it the gift note. "For Chloe, the only star in my sky, can't wait to see you shine at the ball." Thomas went utterly still. He stared at the screen for a full minute, the words burning into his mind. He didn't just see a receipt. He saw their great-grandmother's wedding photograph. He heard their mother's stories. He felt the weight of a legacy that Richard had treated like a cheap trinket to impress a new plaything. Slowly, he closed the tablet and placed it back on the desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes blazing with an anger so profound it was almost silent. "He didn't just cheat on you, Ellie," he said, his voice a low growl. "He didn't just steal from us. He spit on our grandmother's grave. He took our history, our memory, and he used it to decorate his whore." Eleanor finally took a sip of the whiskey. The fire that spread through her chest was a welcome sensation. It was real. It was honest. "I don't want a divorce, Thomas," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "A divorce is civilized. It's a quiet negotiation. There is nothing civilized about this. I don't want to leave him. I want to ruin him." Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped together. He looked less like a lawyer and more like a general planning a campaign. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "I want to take everything," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Sterling Corporation is on the verge of a merger with Omnicorp. It's the deal that will make him a legend. His words, not mine. It's his legacy." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. "I want you to find a way to stop it. Not just stop it. I want it to implode. I want the news to break at the Starlight Ball, while she is standing there, wearing our family's soul around her neck." A slow, terrible smile touched Thomas's lips. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just been unleashed. "He used our name to get the initial funding for his company, didn't he?" Thomas mused, his mind already racing, connecting dots Eleanor couldn't see. "Our father co-signing the loans. He put Vance assets up as collateral to get Sterling off the ground. Richard loves to tell everyone he's self-made. He conveniently forgets the ladder he used to climb out of the mud. He stood up and began to pace, the contained energy of a caged panther filling the room. The merger documents. They'll be hundreds of pages long. He'll have his army of sharks go over them, but they're Richard's sharks. They're looking for threats from the outside. They would never ever look for a threat from the inside, from the very foundation of the company. He stopped pacing and jabbed a button on his intercom. Sarah, get me Mark, David, and the entire corporate litigation team. Conference room 1. Now, and cancel the rest of my day. Within minutes, the quiet sanctuary of his office was transformed into a war room. Two sharp young lawyers, Mark and David, arrived first, their faces a mixture of curiosity and alertness. They were followed by a team of 4 others, all carrying laptops and legal pads. They saw Eleanor sitting in the armchair, a pillar of stillness in the nascent storm, and their expression shifted to one of sober respect. They knew who she was. They knew this was not a normal meeting. Thomas didn't waste time on pleasantries. He projected the tablet screen onto a large monitor on the wall, and a collective, sharp intake of breath filled the room as the emails and the receipt appeared. This is the context, Thomas said, his voice like flint. This is not about a marital dispute. This is about an existential threat to the Vance legacy, which, as it happens, is buried in the foundation of Sterling Corporation. He turned to his team. Richard Sterling is about to merge with OmniCorp. I want you to find me the kill switch. I know it's there. Our father was a trusting man, but he was not a fool. He would have built in a failsafe, a covenant, a clause, a forgotten addendum tied to the original seed money, something that gives the Vance family leverage in the event of catastrophic misconduct or reputational damage. Find it. The room hummed with a new energy. Laptops clicked open. Legal databases were accessed. Thick binders containing the original incorporation documents of Sterling Corporation, documents that had been stored in the Vance family's private archives for years, were brought in from a secure vault. The lawyers worked with a quiet, ferocious intensity. They spoke in a rapid-fire shorthand of clauses, statutes, and precedents. Eleanor sat and watched, the glass of whiskey still in her hand. She was an island of calm in the center of the storm she had created. She listened to the murmurs, the frustrated sighs, the sudden, excited whispers. She felt no impatience. She had all the time in the world. Or rather, she had until the night of the Starlight charity ball. Hours passed. The sky outside the window bled from afternoon blue to the bruised purple of dusk. A junior associate brought in coffee and sandwiches, which sat untouched. Eleanor watched the faces of the lawyers. She saw the hunt in their eyes. They were no longer just employees. They were her soldiers now, fighting a battle for her family's honor. It was David, the younger of the 2 senior partners, who found it. He let out a low whistle, leaning so close to his screen his nose almost touched it. My God, he whispered. Thomas, you need to see this. Thomas was at his side in an instant, followed by the rest of the team. They huddled around the screen, their faces illuminated by its glow. What is it? Thomas demanded. Clause 1138, subsection B, David said, his voice filled with awe. It's in the original seed funding agreement, the one Mr. Vance Sr. co-signed and bond. He pointed to a paragraph of dense legal text. It's a morality clause, but it's written in archaic language. It ties the initial Vance collateral not just to the company's financial health, but to the enduring good name and public honor of the Vance family. Thomas read the text, his eyes widening slightly. Go on. It states, David continued, that if any executive officer, specifically the founder, engages in conduct that brings public scandal or disrepute upon the Vance name, the original co-signers or their legal heirs have the right to declare the initial collateral agreement null and void, retroactively. A stunned silence fell over the room. Mark, the other partner, finally broke it. Retroactively? What does that mean in practice? It means, Thomas said, a grim satisfaction dawning on his face, that the money our father used to secure Richard's first loans was never technically his. If we invoke this clause, the entire financial foundation of Sterling Corporation ceases to exist. It creates a black hole on his balance sheet that goes back 20 years. The merger, Eleanor said, speaking for the first time in hours. Her voice was steady. Thomas looked at her. The Omnicorp deal is contingent on Sterling Corp having a clean and verifiable financial history. If we file this, their due diligence alarms will light up like a Christmas tree. It won't just delay the merger, it will instantly invalidate it. The announcement of a voided merger, combined with the sudden revelation of a multi-billion-dollar hole in his company's finances, will trigger an automatic halt in trading. When trading reopens, the stock will collapse. It will be a slaughter. He turned back to his team. Draft it, he ordered. Draft the legal notice. I want it perfect. I want it airtight. I want it to be the most beautiful, destructive piece of paper this firm has ever produced. For another hour they worked, crafting the language with the precision of bomb makers. They cited the clause, outlined the breach of conduct, and detailed the immediate legal consequences. The document was short, only 3 pages, but each word was a hammer blow. When they were finished, Mark printed out a single copy and handed it to Thomas. Thomas read it over once, then twice. He nodded slowly. He dismissed the team, who filed out of the room with quiet, respectful nods to Eleanor. They knew they had just armed a weapon of mass destruction. The office was silent again. It was just the two of them, brother and sister, surrounded by the shadows. The city lights now twinkled outside, oblivious. Thomas slid the document and a pen across the desk to Eleanor. It needs your signature, he said softly, as our father's heir. Eleanor picked up the pen. Her hand didn't tremble. She looked at the pages, at the cold black words that held the power to dismantle a man's entire world. She thought of Richard's smirk. She thought of the condescending pat on her head. She thought of her great-grandmother's necklace on another woman's skin. She signed her name, her signature, a sharp, elegant slash of ink at the bottom of the page. She pushed the document back to Thomas. He took it, folded it carefully, and placed it inside a thick envelope. He then locked it in a small, personal safe behind his desk. He turned the key, and the click echoed in the quiet room. It was the sound of a coffin being sealed. He walked back to the window and stood beside her, both of them looking down at the glittering city. It was Richard's kingdom, a kingdom built on a lie, a kingdom she was about to burn. It's ready, Thomas said, his voice low and firm. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the city below. The moment you give the word, a courier will file this with the court and serve notice to Omnicorp's legal department. It will all happen in less than 5 minutes. He finally turned to face her, his expression a mixture of grim determination and fierce, protective love. Just give the signal, Eleanor, and I'll burn his empire to the ground. Thomas's final words echoed in the sterile silence of his office. Just give the signal, Eleanor, and I'll burn his empire to the ground. The promise was not a comfort. It was a weapon, cold and heavy in her hands, and the weight of it followed her home. It settled in her bones during the silent car ride back to the penthouse that was no longer a home, but a stage. The days leading up to the Starlight charity ball passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Richard was often out, busy with what he called final merger preparations. He was energized, buoyant, high on the thrill of his impending triumph. He moved through their shared space like a ghost from a different life, a life where Eleanor still loved him. She watched him, her face a mask of serene composure. She smiled when he spoke to her. She asked about his day. Inside, a glacier was moving, carving a new landscape from the ruins of her heart. Every polite word was a lie. Every calm gesture was a rehearsal. On the morning of the ball, Eleanor walked into her closet. It was a room the size of a small boutique, lined with cedar and filled with clothes that told the story of a life she no longer lived. There were the Chanel suits in pale tweed, worn to board meetings for the charities she supported. There were the cashmere sweaters in soft creams and grays, perfect for quiet afternoons. There were evening gowns in deep navy, forest green, and dusty rose, dresses designed for a woman who was an elegant accessory to her powerful husband. Her hand drifted over the fabrics, feeling nothing. These were the clothes of a stranger. They belonged to a woman who trusted, a woman who hoped, a woman who had been a fool. That woman was gone, lost in the cold blue light of a tablet screen. Her fingers stopped on a garment bag at the very back, a purchase made years ago on a whim in Paris. A moment of uncharacteristic rebellion she had never acted upon. She had brought it home and hidden it, thinking it was too loud, too bold, too much. Now she knew it was not nearly enough, but it would have to do. She unzipped the bag. The fabric that spilled out was not quiet or accommodating. It was a deep, shocking crimson, a silk so heavy it moved like liquid, pooling on the floor in a whisper of defiance. The dress was a masterpiece of design, with a sharp architectural neckline and a deceptively simple column that would cling to every curve. It was not a dress for a wife. It was a dress for a reckoning. It was the color of a freshly spilled drop of blood on snow. It was the color of rage, of shame, of a love so deep it had become a mortal wound. Holding it up against her body, she looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The pale, composed woman she saw every day was swallowed by the color. The red devoured the quiet elegance and replaced it with something stark and dangerous. This dress did not ask for attention. It seized it. It held it hostage. This was the one. This was the armor she would wear to her own war. Later that afternoon, she sat at the large mahogany desk in Richard's study, the room where her world had ended. She had avoided it for days, the memory of the tablet clattering on the marble floor, a wound in the silence. But now she entered it with purpose. The air was still thick with the scent of his expensive cologne and his self-satisfaction. She sat in his chair, feeling the worn leather that had molded to his form. For a moment, she allowed the pain to wash over her one last time. The betrayal, the humiliation, the sheer, calculated cruelty of his plan. He didn't just want to discard her. He wanted to annihilate her. He wanted to take her family's most sacred memory and rub it in her face in front of the entire world. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She let it fall onto the polished wood of the desk, a final offering to the grief she was about to bury. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out not a phone, but her grandmother's old address book. Its leather cover was soft with age, the pages filled with elegant, looping cursive. She ran her finger down a list of names under the letter H. Holloway Martha. Martha Holloway was a legend in New York society journalism. For 40 years, her column in the Chronicle had been the final word on who was in, who was out, and why. She was sharp, respected, and notoriously immune to the pressures of new money. More importantly, she had adored Eleanor's grandmother. Eleanor dialed the number, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, a drumbeat for the coming storm. Martha answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp as a starched collar. "Holloway." "Martha, it's Eleanor Vance." There was a brief pause, filled with surprise and curiosity. "Eleanor, my dear, what a pleasure. I was just thinking about the ball tonight. Your grandmother would be so proud of how you've carried on the tradition." "Thank you, Martha. That's kind of you to say." Eleanor's voice was smooth as glass. "I'm calling for a particular reason. I was hoping you might do me the honor of joining me at my table tonight." Another pause, longer this time. A journalist of Martha's stature had her own arrangements, her own carefully chosen vantage points. An invitation to the host's personal table was unheard of. It was a signal. "Your table?" Martha's tone was now laced with professional intrigue. "Eleanor, that's a very generous offer, but I wouldn't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be intruding," Eleanor said, her voice dropping slightly, gaining a new gravity. "I have a feeling this year's ball will be especially memorable. I believe there will be a story, an exclusive, the kind of story that doesn't just define a season, but ends an era." The silence on the other end of the line was electric. Martha Holloway had not survived for 4 decades by missing cues like this one. She could smell a tectonic shift in the city's social landscape from a mile away. "I see," she said slowly. "In that case, Eleanor, I would be delighted to accept your invitation. Table 1, I presume?" "Table 1, Eleanor confirmed. "I'll see you at 8. She hung up the phone and a small, cold smile touched her lips. The audience was secured. The narrator was in place. Now she just needed the script. Her next move was colder, more mechanical. She took the tablet from its hiding place, her fingers no longer trembling as she touched the screen. The emails were still there. The pictures of Richard and Chloe laughing in Paris. The cloying messages. and the final damning receipt. She forwarded the entire chain to the printer, selecting the highest quality photo paper. She watched as the machine whirred to life, a mundane sound for such a monumental task. The page slid out, warm to the touch. The Boucheron and Hayes logo was sharp and clear at the top. The item description, the Vance Starlight necklace, was printed in stark, emotionless text. And beneath it, the gift note she now knew by heart. For Chloe, the only star in my sky, can't wait to see you shine at the ball. The words had lost their power to inflict pain. They were no longer a betrayal whispered in the dark. They were evidence. They were Exhibit A. She carefully folded the thick, glossy paper into a neat square. It felt solid, substantial. She opened the clutch she had chosen for the evening. It was a simple, elegant box of black lacquer, unadorned and severe. It looked like it could hold a secret. She placed the folded paper inside. It fit perfectly. She clicked the clasp shut. The sound was final, like a cell door locking. She held the small black box in her hands. It was so light. It was astonishing that something so light could hold the complete and utter destruction of a man's world. Hours later, the penthouse was filled with the soft sounds of preparation. The whisper of silk, the clink of a glass, the low hum of the city lights coming alive outside the vast windows. Eleanor sat at her vanity, a sea of cosmetics laid out before her like a general's maps. Her movements were precise, unhurried. Each brushstroke was a deliberate act of transformation. She was not putting on makeup. She was putting on a face, the face of a woman who was untouchable. She swept a neutral shadow across her eyelids, blended foundation to flawless perfection, and defined her brows with an architect's precision. Her hands were perfectly steady. There was no tremor, no hesitation. The woman whose hands had shaken so badly she could barely hold a teacup was gone. In her place was this creature of ice and will. She saved the lipstick for last. She chose a shade that perfectly matched her dress, a deep, velvety blood red. As she painted her lips, she met her own eyes in the mirror. The stormy gray was gone, replaced by the hard, reflective sheen of polished steel. She put on simple, brilliant-cut diamond studs. They were small and elegant, designed not to distract. They were the only jewelry she would wear. The main attraction would be on another woman's neck. The bedroom door opened, and Richard walked in. He was already dressed in a flawless tuxedo, a white silk pocket square peeking from his breast pocket. He radiated energy and confidence, a man at the absolute peak of his power, on the precipice of his greatest victory. He was adjusting his cufflinks, a gift from her 2 Christmases ago. He smiled, a wide, brilliant smile that had once made her heart ache with love. Now it made her stomach turn. "Almost ready?" he asked, his voice bright and full of anticipation for the night ahead. He was so caught up in his own triumph, he barely looked at her. He was checking his reflection in the mirror behind her, smoothing his hair. Then his gaze dropped from his own face to hers, and then to the river of red silk that was her dress. He stopped. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by genuine surprise. "Wow," he said, the single word soft with astonishment. "Eleanor." He walked closer, circling her as if seeing her for the first time. "I don't think I've ever seen you wear red." She did not turn from the mirror. She simply lifted her chin slightly, meeting his reflected eyes with her own. Her expression was unreadable, a placid lake over a bottomless depth. "I was saving it," she said, her voice a low murmur, "for a truly special occasion." Richard's grin returned, wider this time, filled with arrogance and a profound, patronizing blindness. He believed this was for him. He believed this transformation, this sudden, shocking boldness, was a tribute to his success. He saw her as the ultimate trophy, finely polished to a high shine for his big night. He leaned down, his lips close to her ear, the scent of his cologne enveloping her. It smelled like lies and cheap victory. "Well," he whispered, his voice a smug, proprietary purr that sent a shiver of revulsion through here. "You look killer, absolutely killer." He had no idea how right he was. Eleanor allowed a small, serene smile to grace her blood-red lips. In the mirror, their eyes met for one last, long moment. the husband and wife, the predator and the prey. Except tonight, the roles were about to be spectacularly reversed. Richard's voice was a smooth, confident murmur beside her in the back of the car. He adjusted his cufflinks, the motion crisp and self-satisfied. He believed his comment about her looking like a killer was a compliment, a flirtation. Eleanor said nothing. She simply watched the city lights blur past the window, each one a distant, cold point in the darkness. The red silk of her gown felt less like a dress and more like a declaration. It was the color of a warning, the color of an ending. His hand rested on her knee, a gesture of possession she had once mistaken for affection. Now it felt like the cold weight of a manacle. She did not pull away. She endured it, letting the chill of his touch fuel the ice forming in her veins. The car slowed, pulling up to the grand entrance of the Metropolitan Grand Ballroom. Before the door was even fully open, the world outside erupted into a frenzy of light. A wall of camera flashes strobed relentlessly, turning the damp night air into a glittering, fractured reality. Richard's hand moved from her knee to the small of her back, a firm pressure guiding her out of the vehicle and into the storm. He smiled for the cameras, a brilliant, predatory smile that the world saw as charisma. Eleanor smiled too. Her smile was a masterpiece of Vance family training, a polite, elegant curve of her lips that revealed nothing and conceded nothing. It was a mask she had worn for years, but tonight it felt different. It was no longer a shield. It was a weapon. They moved up the stone steps, a perfect power couple navigating the river of photographers. Richard Sterling, the self-made titan, and his impeccably bred wife, Eleanor Vance. They were the story everyone wanted, the fusion of new power and old prestige. Her name gave him legitimacy. His money gave her family's legacy a modern pulse. Or so the world thought. Eleanor could feel the whispers on the air, the hungry eyes of the press. She heard her name, his name, the name of the ball itself, the Starlight Charity Ball, her grandmother's legacy. Tonight, Richard intended to tarnish it, to use it as the stage for her ultimate humiliation. He had no idea she was about to burn the stage down. Inside, the grand ballroom was a symphony of excess. Soaring ceilings dripped with crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow over the city's elite. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 expensive perfumes mingling with lilies and champagne. An orchestra played softly, a gentle current beneath the louder river of conversations and laughter. It was a world Eleanor was born into, a world she knew how to navigate with effortless grace. She moved through the crowd, Richard's hand still firmly on her back. She greeted friends of her parents, business leaders, and the city's old matriarchs. Every smile she received felt loaded. Some were tinged with pity, the knowing glances of women who had heard the rumors of Richard's indiscretions. Others were sharp with envy, from those who saw only the wealth and the power. Eleanor treated them all with the same serene poise. Her eyes scanned the room, a general survey of the battlefield. She saw her brother Thomas standing near the far end of the room, speaking with a senior board member from the museum. He caught her eye for a fraction of a second. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The legal filings were ready. The torpedo was in the water, waiting for her signal. A strange calm washed over Eleanor. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, thrilling certainty. Richard leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You see, darling, everyone is here. Everyone who matters." His voice was low, possessive. "Tonight they'll all see what true power looks like." Eleanor turned her head slightly, her serene smile fixed in place. "Yes, they will," she said, her voice a soft, silken thread. She was not talking about his power. They took their places at the head table, a position of honor befitting the event's chairs. The table was filled with Richard's key business partners and their spouses, people whose fortunes were tied to his upcoming merger. They were laughing, drinking, celebrating a victory they believed was already won. Eleanor played her part. She listened to their talk of stock prices and market expansion. She nodded politely. She felt like a visitor from another world, a ghost at her own feast. Inside her small crimson clutch, nestled next to her lipstick, was the printed receipt for the Vance Starlight. The ink on the paper felt heavier than stone. It was her truth, her verdict, her executioner's warrant. Then the moment arrived. The grand double doors at the entrance swung open again, commanded by two uniformed attendants. A hush did not fall over the room. Not at first. It was more subtle than that. It was a shift, a change in the room's magnetic field. A new presence had entered, and the energy of the crowd began to bend toward it. Eleanor didn't need to turn around. She felt it. Chloe Bennett stood framed in the doorway. She was young, beautiful, and glowing with the kind of unshakable confidence that comes from being adored by a powerful man. She wore a shimmering silver dress that clung to her figure, a bold choice for such a traditional event. But no one was looking at the dress. Every eye in the room, as if pulled by an invisible string, was drawn to the magnificent cascade of jewels glittering at her throat. The Vance Starlight. It was a supernova in the warm light of the ballroom. The legendary cornflower sapphire at its center seemed to drink the light, radiating a deep, soulful blue. The antique-cut diamonds surrounding it scattered the light in 1,000 tiny, brilliant flashes. It was more beautiful and more terrible than Eleanor had remembered from the old photographs. It was a piece of her family's soul, a chapter of their history, worn as a trophy by her husband's mistress. Now the hush fell. It started with the tables closest to the door and spread like a wave across the entire ballroom. Conversations faltered. Laughter died in throats. People who had been moving toward the bar stopped mid-stride. The orchestra continued to play, but its music suddenly sounded thin and hollow in the vast, echoing silence of 1,000 people holding their breath. The older guests, the ones who had known Eleanor's mother and grandmother, were the first to understand. Then, Eleanor could see it on their faces. Lady Astor's wineglass paused halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jonathan Crowley, a banker whose family had known the Vances for a century, simply stared, his face a mask of stone. They knew the necklace, they knew its story, and they knew whose wife was sitting at the head table. The insult was breathtaking in its audacity. It was a public execution of Eleanor's dignity, a declaration that Richard could not only take what he wanted, but he could also take what was hers, what was her family's, and flaunt it for the world to see. Chloe, for her part, seemed to bask in the attention. She smiled brightly, thinking the silence was for her beauty, for the sheer spectacle of her arrival. She touched the necklace with a delicate hand, a gesture of ownership, completely oblivious to the cultural bomb that had just detonated in the room. She was a pawn, a beautiful, smiling instrument of Richard's cruelty. Eleanor did not move. She did not gasp. She did not look away. She felt the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes turning from Chloe to her, waiting for her reaction. They were waiting for the tears, for the collapse, for the humiliated wife to flee the room. She would give them nothing. She kept her spine straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The pain was a physical thing, a shard of ice pressing against her ribs. But beneath the pain, the rage was a furnace, burning clean and hot. It melted the pain into pure, focused energy. From across the room, standing now by himself, Richard finally turned to look at her. He had been watching Chloe's entrance, savoring the moment. Now he sought out Eleanor's eyes, needing to see the impact of his masterstroke. Their gazes locked over the heads of the silent, watching crowd. He saw her face, pale and still. He saw her looking at the necklace on Chloe's throat. He thought he saw devastation. He thought he saw defeat. And then he did it. The final cruel twist of the knife. A small, almost imperceptible muscle twitched at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was a smirk. A tiny, quiet, triumphant smirk of absolute domination. It said everything. It said, I have won. It said, you are nothing. It said, your past, your legacy, your very identity, I own it all, and I can give it away to whomever I please. He believed he had broken her. He believed he had mounted her family's history on his wall like a hunting trophy. The smirk hit Eleanor not as an attack but as a release. It was the final confirmation she needed. The last lingering ghost of the man she thought she had married vanished in that single ugly expression. There was nothing left to mourn. There was only something to destroy. She held his gaze, letting him see her stillness. She did not look away. Then, with a slowness that was terrifying in its control, she allowed a serene, unreadable smile to touch her own lips. It was a calm, placid smile that did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were cold, gray and clear, like a winter sky before a blizzard. She lifted her flute of champagne. The crystal was cold against her skin. The tiny bubbles rose in a steady, silent stream. She brought the glass to her lips, never breaking eye contact with her husband. The smirk on his face faltered for just a second, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He did not understand what he was seeing. He was seeing a woman who was not broken. He was seeing a woman who was about to begin. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. The champagne was a ghost on Eleanor's tongue, cold and gone in an instant. Across the ballroom, Richard's smirk was the only thing in focus. It was a small, private gesture in a room of 500 people. A flick of the lips that said, "I won." He believed her smile was a mask for her defeat. He could not feel the chilling calm that had settled in her heart. The orchestra finished its piece. A polite wave of applause followed. This was her moment, the lull she and Thomas had planned for. She placed her champagne flute on the table, the crystal making a faint, resolute click. Her fingers did not tremble. She stood. The blood-red silk of her gown whispered as it fell around her. Every eye in the room, drawn by the motion and the color, turned to her. Richard's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He did not expect her to stand. Eleanor began to walk toward the stage. Each step was measured, deliberate. The cool, smooth fabric of her gown was her armor. Her eyes found her brother Thomas, standing near an exit. He watched her with grim resolve and gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was all she needed. She reached the stage and ascended, waving off a young man who moved to help her. She took the microphone from its stand. The slight feedback it made was the only sound in the now silent ballroom. "Good evening," she began. Her voice was flawless, clear and calm. "I am so honored to welcome you all to the annual Starlight Charity Ball, an evening my grandmother started over 60 years ago." She paused, letting the weight of her family's legacy fill the room. She believed that those of us who have been fortunate have a duty to shine a light for others. Richard was relaxing now. His posture eased. This was the speech he expected. He looked over at Chloe Bennett, who was preening under the attention, her hand resting on the Vance Starlight necklace. "Many of you know my family's history," Eleanor continued, her voice becoming more personal. "You know that during a difficult time, nearly 50 years ago, my great-grandmother made a painful choice. She sold a piece of our heritage to ensure the family's survival, a necklace known as the Vance Starlight." A soft murmur went through the crowd. The older guests glanced toward Chloe, who shifted, feeling a sudden unwelcome heat. "It was more than just a jewel," Eleanor said, her voice dropping slightly. "It was a wedding gift, a promise, a symbol of our family's love and endurance. Its loss was a wound that never truly healed." She took a breath, her gaze sweeping the room before it landed with surgical precision on Chloe. "I had resigned myself to never seeing it again." Her eyes then moved from Chloe to her husband. "But Richard, my husband, is a man who loves grand gestures. He understands the power of symbols." The room was electric with tension. Richard's smile was gone, replaced by a rigid stillness. He did not understand what was happening, but he knew he had lost control. "And tonight," Eleanor announced, her voice ringing with a terrible, crystalline clarity, "he has finally, after all these years, brought the Vance Starlight home to the family by gifting it to his mistress." The gasp was a physical force, sucking the air from the ballroom. A wine glass shattered. Chloe's face went white. Her hand flew to the necklace. But now it felt like a brand, a hot iron searing her skin. The admiring glances had twisted into expressions of shock and disgust. She was no longer a beautiful ingenue. She was a spectacle. Eleanor turned away and walked back to her table with unhurried grace. She did not look at Richard, but she could feel his furious stare burning into her back. She reached her seat and leaned toward the journalist, Martha, whose eyes were wide. Eleanor placed a folded printout into the journalist's hand. It was the receipt, the email, the gift note. "I believe this is the exclusive you were promised," Eleanor said, her voice a low murmur. "Make sure you spell the jeweler's name correctly." Across the room, she met her brother's gaze one last time and gave a single, firm nod. Thomas turned and stepped out of the ballroom. He pulled out his phone and pressed a single name. The call connected instantly. Now, he said, his voice a blade. The legal notice was filed. The Vance family's seed money was recalled. The foundation of Sterling Corp had just been vaporized. Back in the ballroom, a frantic, insistent vibration came from Richard's pocket. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he stared at the screen. It was a flood of alerts from his stock market apps, his board members, his chief financial officer. Red arrows pointing down, numbers plummeting in real time. His company, his empire, was collapsing in a digital firestorm. His face drained of all color. He looked up, his eyes finding Eleanor. She was simply sitting at her table, looking at him with a calm, devastating emptiness. She had done this. Across the room, Chloe Bennett stood frozen, a statue of public humiliation, her hand clutching the necklace that had become her ruin. The metallic click of the microphone settling into its stand was the only sound in the universe. It echoed in the vast, breathless silence of the Metropolitan Grand Ballroom. For a single frozen moment, 1,000 of New York's most powerful people were statues carved from awe and disbelief. Eleanor did not look at Richard. She did not grant Chloe the satisfaction of a final, withering glance. They were specters now, figures in a tableau of ruin that she had painted. They belonged to the past, and her gaze was fixed firmly on the future, which began at the grand doors across the room. She turned with the unhurried grace of a queen leaving a conquered city. Her blood-red gown flowed around her as she descended the few steps from the stage. Each footstep on the polished marble floor was a deliberate, resonant tap, a drumbeat marking the end of an era. The silence finally broke, not with a bang, but with a collective gasp, a wave of whispers that swelled into a roaring tide of gossip and speculation. A phone rang, then another. The sound of Richard's phone, still vibrating on his table, was a frantic, impotent buzz against the rising din. Eleanor began her walk. It was the longest and shortest walk of her life. The crowd, a sea of glittering jewels and dark tuxedos, parted for her as if by an invisible force. She saw faces she had known for years. Beatrice Astor, a woman whose condescending smiles had always made Eleanor feel small, now stared with wide, unblinking eyes, a flicker of what looked like raw admiration in them. She passed Harrison Cole, a senior partner at the law firm that handled Richard's merger. His face was pale, his mouth slightly agape, as if he had just witnessed a financial cataclysm in the flesh. He was not wrong. She could hear the chaos erupting behind her. A woman's sharp, hysterical sob, quickly muffled. That would be Chloe, the scrape of a chair being violently pushed back. Richard, his voice, thick with a rage that choked him, bellowed her name across the ballroom. Eleanor! It was a command, a plea, a threat, all rolled into one desperate sound. She did not slow her pace. She did not turn. Her name from his lips was now a foreign word. It held no power over her. Her inner voice was surprisingly calm, a steady narrator in the storm. One foot in front of the other. The weight of this dress feels like armor. The Vance Starlight is finally free. She felt the ghost of her great-grandmother's hand on her shoulder, a silent, steadying pressure. This was not just an act of destruction, it was an act of reclamation. She had not only exposed a liar, she had reclaimed a legacy he sought to tarnish and sell. Flashes began to erupt from the back of the room as press photographers, smelling the biggest society scandal in a decade, scrambled for position. The light caught the tears streaming down Chloe's face, freezing her in a portrait of public humiliation. It illuminated Richard, his handsome features twisted into a mask of pure fury as he frantically scrolled through the alerts on his phone. The notifications were a waterfall of red, stock prices plummeting, news alerts with his name in the headline. The merger, his magnum opus, was not just failing, it was evaporating. Eleanor ignored it all. Her focus was singular, a distant point of light, the towering oak doors of the ballroom entrance. Near them she saw him, her brother Thomas. He stood perfectly still, a quiet pillar of strength amidst the swirling chaos. He wasn't smiling. His face was grim, but his eyes, so like her own, held a fire of fierce, unwavering pride. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was done. The legal filing was complete. Sterling Corporation was now a house of cards in a hurricane. That single nod was all she needed. It said, "You are not alone." It said, "Welcome home." She reached the doors and pushed. The heavy wood swung inward, and the cool night air washed over her, a clean, sharp shock to her senses. It smelled of rain and damp pavement, a stark contrast to the cloying scent of expensive perfume and fear she left behind. The roar of the ballroom was instantly muffled, reduced to a dull, distant throb. For a moment she stood alone on the stone steps, the city stretching out before her. The distant wail of a siren felt like a lament for the life she had just immolated. A discreet black sedan pulled silently to the curb. The driver's door opened and Arthur, a man with silver hair who had driven her father for 30 years, stepped out. He walked around and opened the rear door for her, his movements practiced and respectful. He did not speak. He did not need to. His eyes, kind and familiar, held a depth of understanding that was more comforting than any words of pity could ever be. This simple act of quiet loyalty, of returning to the fold of people who saw her as a Vance and not just a Sterling, was the first step of her new life. She slid onto the cool leather of the back seat. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sealing her off from the wreckage. As the car pulled away from the curb, she allowed herself a single glance in the side view mirror. It was not a look back, but a final confirmation. She saw a frantic swarm of people spilling out from the ballroom entrance. Photographers scrambled, their flashes like a swarm of angry fireflies. They were feasting on the carcass of the life she had left behind. She felt nothing. No triumph, no regret, only a profound, hollowed-out peace. The car moved smoothly into the river of traffic, the glittering lights of the city blurring into long streaks of red and gold through the window. The adrenaline that had sustained her for hours finally began to recede, leaving behind an ache that was deep and vast. It was the ache of amputation. A part of her had been cut away tonight, a part that had loved and trusted and hoped. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek. It was not a tear for Richard. It was a tear for the naive girl who married him, for the years spent tending a garden that was secretly poisoned at the root. It was a tear for the end of a story. With a steady hand, she wiped it away. Her fingers were cold, but they did not tremble. She turned her gaze from the window to the road ahead, to the darkness that wound through the canyons of steel and glass. The future was a vast, unwritten territory. It was not bright, it was not dark, it simply was. And for the first time in a very long time, she was the one holding the pen. What would you have done? One line in the comments, let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.